A lot of what I learned about creative writing, I learned in college. I spent a lot of time revising draft after draft after draft, and I dreamed of one day being an author. But not just any author, for at the time I said something that still sticks with me and that was profoundly arrogant. I said, I don't just want to write, I want to write great. Greetings, Miskatonic Repository. My name is Heinrich Mohr, and I am an idiot. I hope you'll agree my past philosophy is some chef's kiss-worthy arrogance, but it summed up my thinking at the time, and I still struggle to escape that way of thinking now. Maybe you have as well. As you've worked on your Call of Cthulhu scenarios, have you ever thought to yourself, I've done a lot of work on this scenario, but you know what? Could still be better. Or maybe you've thought about all the great ideas you still want to incorporate into your scenario. Or maybe how you need just one more playtest to perfect it. Or one more map. Or one more handout. Or maybe the only way you've published is by making yourself sick of looking at your own writing. If any of these sound familiar, then perhaps you can sympathize a little with my slightly more arrogant younger self, and may derive something of value from this video on when enough is enough, on knowing when you're done. So here we are talking about figuring out when to stop tinkering with your Call of Cthulhu scenario and pushing it out the door. I'll share my approach, which may be somewhat controversial, but I'm going to try and persuade you that the time to publish is when you are satisfied the product is 80% as good as you can make it. But wait, you might say, 80%? That's only 4/5 done. If you removed a fifth of a piece of pie, that would be a lot of pie. 80%? Every one of my products on the Miskatonic repository is only 80% as good as I could make it. As to each, I can give you a long list of all the things I would have wanted to include but didn't. All the art that didn't make it or just plain didn't get made. And that's a good thing. Before I continue, let me be upfront that I did not come up with this approach. I learned it via the author Hank Green, in a video much more concise and superior to this one, that you should go watch. I'll try not to repeat too much of what he says because, well, you should go watch it. And here we are specifically concerned with Call of Cthulhu scenarios. Still, a lot of the same lessons apply. So, why should you stop once you hit 80% personal satisfaction? Why not make the product 87% or 91% as good as you can make it? Well, as the question suggests, once you get past 80%, it becomes increasingly hard to tell how close to 100% done you are. I think there's a few reasons for that. Practically, as you get closer to 100%, you get into a kind of Zeno's paradox. The closer and closer you get, the more personal preference becomes apparent. This is even more the case in writing a scenario for a tabletop RPG, a product that will be read by one person through the lens of how they manage their own table, and then further interpreted through interactions with 2, 3, 4 or more players. Simply put, some keepers want lots of information. Some want a bare outline. My own scenarios run almost 30,000 words. Some people really like that. Some very much don't. And I don't think they're wrong and I'm right, but we would each give very different answers to what my scenario needs to get it closer to 100%. You can't control for those preferences. And anyway, those preferences may reflect equally good solutions to writing your scenario. Simply put, there may not be one clear-cut way for your scenario to be better. Welcome to 80%. So anything past 80% gets us into the realm of personal preference and the uncalculable, but there's other practical reasons to stop at 80%. First, it's a way of actually getting products out the door. Many of us have committed the sin of half-finishing a product. By the time you've hit 80%, you've done a lot of work. Maybe you're running out of steam. We know that the last 20% is often when 90% of the work awaits. Rather than run the risk of not finishing, maybe it just means you're ready to publish. Second, aiming for 80% gives you a way to forgive yourself for killing your darlings. When I start writing a scenario, I usually have lots of grandiose ideas. Some of those get incorporated, but others wait in the wings. By the time I get to them, though, the scenario may have changed so that incorporating those ideas now is going to be a chore. For my scenario, The Great Trap, I had, for the longest time, wanted to have the player handouts fit together like a jigsaw puzzle, creating a big, crazy conspiracy board. It would have required a lot more work, including a lot of graphical design. An already delayed scenario would have been delayed even further. So it didn't happen. It was part of my original plan, but I'm only looking for 80%, so I'm okay telling myself that I can let this idea go on living in my idea notebook, ready to see the light of day in a future project. Third, and perhaps most importantly, aiming for 80% saves you from two traps: the burden of being a perfectionist and the fear of being a failure. I think there are many good reasons not to be a perfectionist. For me, describing myself as a perfectionist has at times been an excuse not to release a product, not because it wasn't ready, but because I was scared of what others would think of something I describe as done. The idea that you could create a product that is perfect, even if only in your eyes, is also in many ways an illusion. I am not an authority on perfection, and even if I were, I certainly am not for a project I'm so invested in succeeding. You're always going to know the thing better than anyone else. You will see flaws that others will not. The idea of perfectionism also ignores that we get better as we do things more. Quite simply, most of us don't have the skills to achieve perfection, whatever that may mean. Such skills don't get developed unless you put your ideas out there. Looking back, the idea of achieving perfection may in fact be the very thing keeping you further from that goal. Lastly, perfectionism invites burnout. We shouldn't always be firing on all cylinders, especially with creative pursuits that on some level should be fun. Take playtesting as an example. The more we playtest, the more possible ideas get introduced, and the more work you have. Rather than treat playtesting as confirming whether something works at the table, we sometimes use it to fish for new ideas, and in so doing, push the finish line ever further away. Perfectionism can be a bottomless pit. But some of us can't help aiming for that impossible horizon. That's why consciously telling yourself that you are not making the scenario the best it can be, but only 80% of what it could be, may be a way of letting yourself off the hook. You may be able to escape the trap of perfectionism. As important as letting go of the burden of perfectionism is overcoming the fear of being a failure. Failing sucks. I take an entire year to write a scenario. If it's a bust, that's a crushing amount of time I've wasted. Or is it? Overcoming failure requires failing. Aiming for 80% gives me permission to fail and get better. Was the scenario bad? Well, I only put 80% of my possible effort into it, so of course I'll do better next time. Plus, with the skills I've developed, whatever my new 80% is, will actually be much closer to what would have been 100% before. If we don't give ourselves permission to fail, there are some skills we also may never develop. For example, a common challenge for writers is how to end a scenario. But that's just a skill. You get better at writing endings by, well, writing more endings. But that may not happen if you abandon a project. The same with making maps. Just make more of them. My first scenario, Unremembered, didn't include a map, and I got called out for it. My second scenario, Little Torches, had a map, and it was pretty ugly. My third scenario, The Great Trap, well, you know what? I like the map in The Great Trap. Let me give you another embarrassing example about myself. I cannot draw. I've spent hours and hours getting better at it, but fundamentally, I can't draw. Nevertheless, for my scenario, The Great Trap, I wanted to include some original art. I worked on a picture of a Yithian for dozens of hours. Ultimately, the results were disappointing. I ended up using a Microsoft Word filter to make it look at all usable. My efforts earned me a mention in Pookie's Reviews from Relier, where the artwork in the scenario is described as scrappy. That sounds pretty accurate. But I never would have developed even the beginning of drawing skills if I hadn't accepted that what I was ultimately going to put hours of effort into was not going to meet the standards I had for the scenario. So, along with a bunch of good reasons, aiming for 80% saves you from being a perfectionist and gives you permission to be a failure. But let me pull back somewhat because I want to be clear about what I'm not recommending. I'm not telling you to skip steps. I always read multiple drafts. I always playtest. I always ask someone else to run my scenario and tell me how it goes. If you aren't doing the things you normally would, you probably haven't hit 80% personal satisfaction. The key is to react appropriately to what you learn from all those things you do. Did a playtest suggest a possible fourth act to add to your 3-act scenario? Maybe that should be a new scenario. Is making a map giving you heart palpitations? Maybe the scenario doesn't need a map. It turns out you get to choose when you're done. Hopefully this video has given you reasons for choosing to be done at 80%. I want to thank the Miskatonic Repository Convention Discord community for encouraging me to discuss this topic. If you enjoyed this video, consider subscribing, but more importantly, consider joining the conversation in the MRCon Discord. We hope to see you there. Until then, stay tuned for more.